Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode. In this video, in my ongoing series on Scott Adams' book, Win Bigly, we're going to talk about the making of a hypnotist. Just what hypnotism is, how Scott got into it, and just how it helped him shape his view of how the world works. Now, hypnotism is really just a special form of persuasion. And when Scott was training to be a hypnotist, I think the main thing he got out of it was the realization that all hypnotists know is that we as human beings are irrational 90% of the time. And that is really not the common view. Now, with hypnotism, in Scott's opinion and what he's observed, everyone can be hypnotized if they are willing. And that's kind of a key point. However, there is a much smaller group, roughly 20%, that can experience what hypnotists call the phenomena. And it's really just being hyper acceptable, I guess, to being hypnotized. And the big example of this for Scott, which I think made a big impression on him, was that his mom had a story that she was able to give birth with no pain, as the doctor delivering the baby was actually a hypnotist, and actually told Scott's mom that I think from watching you that this is actually an option, and it turned out to be correct. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about hypnotists and hypnotism. One of the main ones is that no hypnotist can make you do anything against your will. So the Hollywood idea that you can hypnotize someone to become an assassin, for example, simply isn't true. In general, when you're hypnotized, you're always aware of your environment, you're aware of what's happening, and you need to be a willing participant. Basically, you're just very, very relaxed and open to suggestion, but it never takes over your will. This is also why hypnotism usually doesn't work for things like losing weight or quitting smoking. And the reason for that is quite obvious, in that with losing weight, the reason why people need to lose weight is because they truly like eating food. And hypnotism isn't going to change that. Same thing with smoking. People generally like smoking, the feeling of smoking, how it makes them feel. And deep down, they don't want to give that up. And that's why hypnotism is quite ineffective in making those kinds of behavioral modifications. Now, one question I'm sure you have, and what I had as well, is we've all seen these sort of stage hypnosis shows where people go on stage and do ridiculous things. So if on the one hand you say that you can't make people do things against their will, how can you have people embarrassing themselves by pretending to be a chicken or that kind of thing? The truth is that to a certain degree, what you're seeing is actually a magic trick. In that when you're sitting in the audience, you're assuming the person on stage is just like you. But in reality, they are not. When you are willing to go on stage to be hypnotized, you are kind of showing that you have a much lower, or that being embarrassed doesn't really bother you as much as the average person. And the hypnotist picks up on that. And this could happen for a variety of people, including introverts. I know sometimes people get pulled on stage and people are like, oh, that's not like Bob or Sue. They're usually so quiet. But the fact of the matter is introverts can actually enjoy going in front of thousands of people, as entertainers and entertaining. So that's why hypnotism seems to work, or seems to allow people to go against their will, but that's not really the case. People actually like kind of showing off in those instances, and the hypnotist picks that out. Now, when you really understand hypnosis, so you learn what it can't do. It can't make people lose weight or just quit smoking or do anything against the will. Nonetheless, it does give you, to a certain degree, almost a superpower, in that you can relate to people in different ways now. again, like I said before, it absolutely changes your worldview, because if you understand hypnosis, you understand that people are irrational 90% of the time. And it's going to change the way you act and how you act with the rest of people and the rest of the world. And that's just the fact of the matter. We all live with people. You have to deal with people in a variety of situations, whether you like it or not. And it's best to understand what you're really dealing with rather than what you think you're dealing with. And what you're really dealing with is irrational people. So, for example, hypnosis, or his understanding of hypnosis, allows Scott to make seemingly crazy election predictions. The obvious one was Donald Trump's win, which we've already talked about. But less well known was he predicted the end of Carly Fiorina's campaign when she was running against Trump for the Republican nomination. And what Carly did at one of her speeches was she made a very impassioned anti-abortion argument, in which apparently she even showed a video showing a stillborn baby or an aborted baby. As soon as Scott saw this, he knew that her campaign was over, because what Carly had done from a persuasion point of view is associate her campaign with a dead baby. Now, later on, when Carly Fiorina's campaign was, I think at that point it was at 15%, it went down to 4%, and then it just petered out. People will come up with other reasons for why they decided not to support Carly Fiorina. But the reality is in Scott's view, it was that pairing, that disastrous pairing of dead baby with your campaign. Once again, people are irrational and will make irrational decisions and then rationalize it later. And that was a perfect example of that. How Scott created the comic Dilbert is another example of persuasion. In that, in Dilbert, as well as in communicating and writing, which we'll see later on, if you want to be effective, it's quite important to sort of leave spaces where people can insert themselves into whatever narrative you're spinning. In the case of Dilbert, like, we have no idea what his last name is, for example. And the reason for that is, if you know his last name, you might know what kind of ethnic background he has. And so if you know he's Polish and you're not Polish, that separates you. But when you don't know what it is, you can kind of say, oh, maybe I am like Dilbert. Same thing with not knowing his boss's name. So it could be your boss. You don't know what company he works at. It could be your company. And so again, by leaving these blank spaces, people subconsciously then think that Dilbert's job is just like me, and I can really relate to this character. I mean, it's very persuasive. Lie detection. One thing you learn through hypnosis is that if you're accusing someone who's actually innocent, they will typically deny it immediately. So if you say, did you steal that bunch of money? They'll say no right away. But if they're guilty, they'll typically give you some kind of response along the lines of, what evidence do you have? And so that's the difference between innocent and guilty people when confronted with an accusation. The area of romance, as far as persuasion goes. Not surprisingly, love, romance, and sex are irrational 90% of the time. And there's a lot of guys out there know, being nice only gets you so far. Once again, you're irrational 90% of the time, and from an evolutionary perspective, what we're looking for, what women are looking for in particular, although men as well, is good genes. So the best way from a persuasion standpoint to attract the man or woman you want is show that you have good genes. So in the case of men, you might join some kind of co-ed event or class that you're really good at, and in that case you will stand out, and it will show you that to the opposite sex that you have good genes. And obviously this is why being talented, attractive, smart, or muscular are all very positive things. no surprise there, but that's why it works. On a side note, some people make the observation that, nice guys finish last, and bad boys sort of get women. And what Scott's view is, I think if you look closely at it, that's only very superficial, and that the bad boys typically have also some combination of being talented, attractive, smart, or muscular. I mean, you very rarely you're going to see ugly people being bad, because it just doesn't work for them. So the fact that a bad boy gets a woman, it's not because he's bad, but because he's showing that he has very good genes by being talented, attractive, smart, or muscular. Communication. This is obviously very important as far as hypnosis goes, or persuasion, and that anytime you're communicating with someone, you're typically trying to persuade that person in some fashion. It may be just to make them laugh, maybe to buy something, or simply see things your own way. And once again, through hypnosis, when you understand that people are irrational 90% of the time, it will make your communication that much more effective. Finally, we have some persuasion tips. Most of these on the surface seem pretty obvious, but I think it's important to go over them. So if you want to convince somebody of something, it's incredibly important to display confidence, whether it's real or fake. If you're going to persuade someone of your view, you have to make it look like you believe in it yourself, and if you don't, no one else will. Persuasion is strongest when the messenger is credible. Now, when Scott was taking his classes in hypnosis, what he found was he could typically practice on strangers, because he'd go up to them and say, I'm taking a class on persuasion, can I try a couple of things? And people would be receptive to that. But people who knew him beforehand didn't see him as a persuasive hypnotist, because they already knew him, and it just simply wouldn't work in those situations. Another persuasive technique is to guess what people are thinking before they say it. And if you're able to do that, it creates a bond. So if you're looking at someone and you say, oh wow, you look really hungry right now, which is kind of a silly example, but if they're thinking that, it creates a bond. Now if you're wrong and they're not hungry, it doesn't matter, like they'll just ignore it. But being able to anticipate what people are thinking by observing them and then commenting on it can create a strong bond, which can be very persuasive later on. And like I said before, with the Dilbert and with the communication, leaving out unimportant details allows people to put themselves into your narrative or whatever you're trying to persuade them of, and that will make whatever writing you're doing that much more effective. And with that, that's really it. The hypnosis thing I think is pretty straightforward, although for myself I found the whole explanation of how stage hypnotists make people do those crazy things to be fairly interesting. But what do you think? If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And I'm going to be going to the next chapter, which I think, or next section, which is going to deal much more with Donald Trump and his persuasion techniques, I suspect. But in the meantime, like I say, that's it for now, and until next time.